Cloud breaks limited. After a very grey day today, the Midlands and Eastern England will continue cloudy and murky this evening. There will also be some mist and fog in places, perhaps becoming locally dense at times. Moving towards northern England, and we should see plenty of clear skies this evening, especially across Cumbria and Northumberland. This will lead to a chilly evening with perhaps some isolated fog patches forming. The coastal areas and the central belt of Scotland may see some cloud linger this evening, but elsewhere across Scotland will be dry and clear, leading to a cold start to the night. We move back into the cloud across Northern Ireland, with the cloud lowering at times to give some mist and fog in places, especially over the higher ground. Overnight, we will see little change across the country, with a clear but frosty night expected in the north.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Good evening, you're watching The Discussion with me, Anaya Falarin Emmanuel. We discuss the big moral, cultural and political questions of our time. We've got a packed show for you this evening, the future of conservatism following the shocking North Shropshire by-election result, to feminism and the gender debate. All that and much more coming up on this hour. But first, as usual, here's the bulletins.
Hello, I'm Karen Roberts. These are your latest headlines. A major incident has been declared in London over the rapid spread of Omicron. Mayor Sadiq Khan says he's concerned by the huge surge in COVID cases and the increase in hospitalisations. He's urging Londoners to book a vaccine appointment or go to a walk-in centre as soon as possible. He says key public services will work together closely to minimise the impact on the city. Cabinet ministers have been briefed on the latest data regarding the Omicron COVID variant. It comes as new reports suggest a 2-week lockdown is being planned in England after Christmas to try to reduce the spread. 90,400 COVID cases were recorded in the UK over the last 24 hours. International hospitality consultant Peter Gordon told GB News that businesses need more clarity.
All we want to do is know where we stand within the industry, because we do need financial help, because I'm in the middle of it and I see already owners making decisions and sort of saying, can we afford to keep this person on? Can we afford to, should we be closing our hotel? Do we close early? And that's very, very difficult.
Experts are warning restrictions similar in scale to the national lockdown are needed to keep hospital admissions from COVID below previous peaks. Documents released by the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies also warn that indoor mixing is the biggest risk factor for the spread of Omicron. The body says advice has been given to ministers. The rush of people trying to beat France's new COVID travel restrictions has led to knock-on effect on freight traffic, resulting in long queues of lorries. There were lengthy tailbacks on the M20 motorway in Kent heading to Dover and at the entrance to the Channel Tunnel earlier. The COVID measures include restrictions on people entering France from the UK. Only essential travel is permitted, except for French nationals and residents. A number of police officers have suffered minor injuries in what they are calling scuffles at an anti-vaccine protest in London. The Met Police say the officers were injured while attempting to escort a police motorcyclist through Parliament Square. Video footage posted on social media shows shoving between police and protesters. No arrests have been made. A woman who was arrested after 4 children died in a house fire in South London has been released on bail. The 27-year-old was detained on suspicion of child neglect after the blaze at a property in Sutton on Thursday evening. Brothers Kyson and Bryson, aged 4, and Leighton and Logan, aged 3, died. Their father, Dalton Hoth, described them as bright, caring, lovable boys. Cabinet Secretary Simon Case has stepped down from leading an investigation into alleged parties held in government during lockdown. It comes after the Cabinet Office admitted a quiz was held in his department last December. Officials say he played no part in the event, but did speak briefly to staff before leaving. A Number 10 spokesperson said the move was made to ensure the probe retains public confidence. Senior civil servant Sue Gray will take over. And a national charity is urging government action to help millions of older people heat their home this winter. Age UK says 45% of over 60s are worried about staying warm amid the soaring cost of energy. They're calling for an extra one-off payment of £50 for those eligible for help with energy bills.
Older people are just feeling like they're in a, between a rock and a hard place. They're very scared about going out and meeting people because of the threat of COVID and Omicron. But at the same time, they're deeply worried about how they can afford to keep their homes warm while energy prices have surged so much. There are already 1.4 million older people living in fuel poverty, and we're worried that the conditions this winter are going to push thousands more people into fuel poverty.
Well, that's all your news for now. Let's now get back to Inaya.
Welcome to the discussion. This month, award-winning dancer Rosie Kay resigned from her own company, her own dance company, after complaints were made to the company's board after she expressed her views on transgender identity. She expressed her views on sex and gender in a conversation at a private dinner party she threw in her home for company dancers. The complaints that ultimately led to Rosie Kay's resignation from the company were made by 4 of the dancers who attended the party, some of whom identify as non-binary. There are disputes about what exactly was said at the party that led to the complaints. However, Rosie Kay has stated that she doesn't believe a person can change sex and regards, in her words, the presence of males who may falsely say that they are trans women in female toilets can cause trauma to women who have suffered sexual assault, as a significant number of women have. Well, joining me now to discuss this is Raquel Rosario Sanchez from the Centre of Gender and Violence Research at the University of Bristol. Thank you so much for joining me this evening, Raquel. I mean, the first thing that, when looking into this story, it does seem a bit complicated in the sense that she expressed those views at a private dinner party that she held for many people that she manages in her own dance company. But some people might say that this is clearly quite a hot button debate, a discussion that is very tense and has a lot of toxicity within it. And is that really an appropriate place to be discussing some of those contentious political ideas, in your home amongst people that you work with. What do you say to that criticism?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here, but I'm very sad that here we are discussing again a situation in which women are being targeted over the opinions that they shared. I don't think that it is controversial or that it is in some way inflammatory for women to share opinions about sex-based rights and gender, which is exactly what Rosie Kay was doing. So I would say that it is perfectly normal, and it should be expected that people are allowed to engage in conversations about policy and about law in their homes or in their workplaces. What is abnormal is to have this climate in which a conversation about sex and gender has to become sort of a polemic that incites accusation of hatred and then turns into a whole bullying campaign, which is what happened to Rosie Kay.
No, I really understand that, but I mean, I must emphasise that Rosie does dispute some of the things that are claimed that she says. But according to some of the dances that attended, she said that allowing trans people to take hormone blockers is creating eunuchs. Trans women are a danger to actual men in toilets and only want to access female toilets to commit sexual assault. I mean, do you not see that as quite inflammatory?
I would question whether that is exactly what she said. You know, those are the views of the dancers. But I would like to emphasize that what happened in this situation is that Rosie Kay, who is an acclaimed dancer and choreographer, she was hosting a party for dancers in her company to make them feel more relaxed, more sort of loosen up after the pandemic in preparation for a play called Romeo and Juliet. During the conversation, she talked about her next performance, which was going to be an adaptation of Virginia Woolf's Orlando. So Orlando is about a man who, through his imagination, manages to change his biological sex and manages to live hundreds of years. Obviously, this is fantasy. So she started this conversation, and then that led to a back and forth about whether people can actually change sex. Now, I think that is, there's no reason why the attacks on Rosie Kay that followed that situation, there's no reason for that to have escalated to a point in which now she has had to resign. She's only the latest woman out of a long list of women who have been bullied and harassed because of their views on sex and gender.
I think that the point that you're making about the way in which it's escalated is a really interesting and strong point, because a lot of the time, you know, when you do have political disputes or disagreements with people that you know and you're familiar with, you disagree, but then, you know, at the end of the day, you know, they're lovely people, they're your friends, and you can let go of them and you can move on. And what is quite striking about this incident is how they took it to the company board. And there does seem to be this trend of you can't just disagree amongst friends or colleagues and move on, but actually things have to escalate. People take the steps further to potentially threaten people's jobs or prevent them from, you know, going into spaces. And isn't that more of the worry, how it escalates in this day and age?
Yes, I think that you're making a very important point, which is about good faith in conversations. I think everyone who is watching this show can relate to having a disagreement with their boss, or their boss is saying something that they don't really doesn't agree with their views. That's normal. But what is abnormal is to sort of pretend that this is some sort of personal and violent attack on people's identity that requires not only vilification, but also that people are fired from their jobs. So what happened to Rosie is that complaints were made against her. She was forced to apologize. And then after she apologized, they said, well, the apology is not enough. Then she was forced to undergo gender training. What is gender training? And then after she resigned, then that was also not enough. She had to do more. And I think that we really have to emphasize how dystopian it is to have this expectation that women have to flagellate themselves for perfectly normal views about sex and gender.
And in your view, why has this become so controversial? Because I think this is what a lot of ordinary people, and including myself, get surprised about. Views that what we learned in school about biology and the fact that there is males and females has now, in the last 5 years, seemingly become so controversial. Do you have any sense why it has become so toxic, this debate?
I think that the debate about gender identity and sex-based rights has become very toxic because the tactic of transactivism was to impose these policies and legislations through the back door, commenting or sharing in the public sphere, having public discussions about it. But the fact that women are insistent, women like Rosie Kay, who are just doing it in the comfort or of their homes. The fact that women are insisting, no, we have to have a conversation, because this is not just a trans rights issue, this is also a women's rights issue. The fact that women have opened this debate, then that has enraged people who didn't want the public to know about this situation.
But would you say that that's quite a perhaps more cynical view of the way that the activism plays out? I mean, for some organisations, Stonewall and others, do legitimately and sincerely believe that we should be moving away from sex as a way of organising rights within society and looking at gender primarily. And actually people that are trans-identified individuals face insecurity within their own body, they face prejudice, they face barriers, and actually it's much safer for them to be included in women's spaces than necessarily be included in the spaces that is for the sex that they have.
Yeah, and that is a perfectly acceptable view that should be discussed publicly. So what I say to that is that, of course, organizations like Stonewall or even the dancers at Rosie Kay's dance company, they are allowed to hold these views. But we need to share this conversation democratically and with the public. And that is precisely what all of us feminist campaigners on this issue want. That is precisely what Rosie was doing when she started that conversation about Orlando.
But why do you feel that Rosie resigned? I mean, she described the procedure of investigation as unfair, opaque and horrific. But is it really right if people resign? Should they not stay in these organisations and institutions and take a firm stand to prevent a chilling effect from occurring?
Personally, it may not have been the option that I would have taken, but every woman knows her circumstances. And I can imagine how difficult it was for her to be in a situation in which, listen, I'm hosting this dinner party for dancers in my company because I want them to feel good. And then I find myself in this investigation and all of these accusations of hatred and transphobia. I can imagine what she went through and why she made that decision. There are women in this conversation of sex and gender that do resign from their posts, professors who resign from their posts, go to other universities. There are other women who stay and take a different course of action. So.
And Raquel, I mean, why have you become somebody that has been speaking increasingly about this subject? As far as I'm aware, you have some personal experiences of what's gone at the University of Bristol when it comes to you expressing some similar views to Rosie Kay around violence against women and women's sex-based rights. Could you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, well, in a way, what happened to me is similar to what happened to Rosie, in that I was just sharing a meeting to discuss these issues publicly, a Women's Place meeting where we were having a conversation about these proposals for sex self-identification. And all I did was put my name on an event saying I am willing to share this meeting. And the second that happened, trans activist students at the University of Bristol saw that that was unacceptable and that they had to target me through bullying and harassment and try also to cancel that meeting. So what I'm saying is, here you have two women, myself and Rosie, among hundreds around the UK, who are just saying, you know what, let's just have this conversation openly. And what's happening is that proponents of gender identity policies and legislation, they don't want that conversation to happen. So then things escalated. What Rosie decided to do is that she decided to resign because she saw that that was the only option that she had. I decided to take a different course of action, and I have now launched a legal action against the University of Bristol.
And finally, what would you like to see change? Because I think, wanting a public debate, wanting a much more democratic conversation is obviously quite fundamental in this, but would you like the self-identification lobby to not succeed in their efforts to change the law in order to make gender identification something that is a matter of personal decision and choice?
I think before we have a conversation about what would I personally want to see in the law, we need just a public debate that is democratic, where people are not afraid of losing their jobs, where people are not afraid of what might happen if I say the wrong thing during a dinner party in my own home. Before we get to what the legislation itself might look like, because we all can have different opinions about what it could look like. Before that, we just need to talk. And that is precisely what Rosie Kay was doing.
Well, thank you so much, Raquel Rosario Sanchez. I think this is going to be a conversation that many people are going to continue to have. That was Raquel from the Centre for Gender and Violence Research at the University of Bristol. Thank you. So coming up, we explore the future of conservatism with Wokingham MP John Redwood, and also what could the upcoming French election mean for Western Europe? Stay with us.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking rather cloudy for many, although there will be some clear spells around. Let's take a look at the details. Zooming into the southwest, and although it will be dry, there'll be plenty of cold around, although parts of Devon and Cornwall will see some clearer skies at times. Southeast England and East Anglia will also see rather cloudy skies, with the cloud lowering to give some mist and fog in places. Western Wales will have a largely clear but chilly evening, whereas further east it'll be cloudy, with cloud breaks limited. After a very grey day today, the Midlands and Eastern England will continue cloudy and murky this evening. There will also be some mist and fog in places, perhaps becoming locally dense at times. Moving towards northern England, and we should see plenty of clear skies this evening, especially across Cumbria and Northumberland. This will lead to a chilly evening with perhaps some isolated fog patches forming. The coastal areas and the central belt of Scotland may see some cloud linger this evening, but elsewhere across Scotland will be dry and clear, leading to a cold start to the night. We move back into the cloud across Northern Ireland, with the cloud lowering at times to give some mist and fog in places, especially over the higher ground. Overnight, we will see little change across the country, with a clear but frosty night expected in the north.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Join us for the Political Correction. We're here every Sunday to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge.
We talk about all areas of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland.
Our debate goes way beyond the Westminster Village. It's about the real country. It's about your opinion. So please, we want you to tell us what you think.
This is the Political Correction.
Every Sunday morning from 10 a.m. here on GB News.
You're watching GB News live across the UK, the world, and our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We're here for you. Don't forget to join our community by hitting the subscribe button.
And download the GB News app so you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you. Email us at gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
Welcome back to the discussion. Well, France will vote to elect a new president in April next year. The current president, Emmanuel Macron, has yet to declare his candidacy, but is expected to run again. a feature that has been particularly notable about this upcoming election has been how the subjects of immigration, integration and French identity have been at the forefront of the public debate in France. The inclusion of hard-right TV pundit and public intellectual Eric Zemmour into the French presidential race has been credited for much of this focus. Well, joining me to understand why these issues have become so prominent in the French political discourse is French-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani. Thank you so much for joining me. Firstly, for people who have not been following this at all, who are the key figures, in your view, in this upcoming French presidential election?
Well, inevitably, the key figure is Emmanuel Macron, who is the current president of France. And he's particularly interesting because if he wins, he will be the first president in many, many years of winning a second term. Now, this is important because a modern government requires a fair amount of time in charge so as to implement policy. And we've seen with former presidents, François Hollande and Nicolas Sarkozy, they were pretty much lame ducks because they failed to implement change and they never won a second term. So the possibility for a 10-year presidency with Macron is something to look out for. Now, there are clearly two far-right candidates as well, Marine Le Pen and Éric Zemmour, who are fascinating for far more sinister reasons. They haven't got sound economic policies. Instead, they rely on reactionary sound bites. And their programme is aimed at retreating from the global economy and indeed pushing an anti-immigration France first type of agenda, resorting or calling for the restoration of what they view as old-fashioned values. There's also a character of interest who is Valérie Pécresse of the Conservative Party. She would be the first woman to become president. She modelled herself on Margaret Thatcher and Angela Merkel. She says she's 1/3 Margaret Thatcher and 2/3 Angela Merkel. And but it has to be said that the Conservative Party has had a lot of sleaze scandals, not least of all because the former president, Nicolas Sarkozy, and his minister, François Fillon, are facing prison time, and it will be very difficult to shake off that image. And lastly, the left is massively split in France. They never seem to agree on anything and unite. Ironically, the left is massively strong in France. It's traditionally a left-wing country, but you've got fringe movements of the socialists and the communists who seem to disagree far more with each other than they hate the right.
Well, one of the things that has been really striking, you mentioned Marine Le Pen and Zemmour, has been the almost civilizational rhetoric that has been coming out of the campaign so far. It's been very much about French identity and integration. In August 2021, Zemmour said, "We have to stop the flow. I'm not just talking about the illegals. I'm thinking first of legal immigration. This is a process of replacing the population from the moment there are too many immigrants who no longer assimilate. It's inevitable." And actually, we also had Michel Barnier, the EU's Brexit negotiator, also saying immigration is out of control. Why do you think that this rhetoric, this civilization threat rhetoric has become such a focal point of this upcoming election?
Well, I wouldn't say that it suddenly has become a focal point. Let's not forget that France has always been a country where is very much grounded in right-wing politics. And remember that back in 2002, we already had, that's 20 years ago, Jean-Marie Le Pen, a notorious far-right leader, who came second at the presidential election. He's now a convicted racist and anti-Semite, and his daughter, Marine Le Pen, is a candidate for the forthcoming election. So what we're effectively seeing is a move even further to the right, to the extreme right, and that's embodied by a character like Zemmour, who absolutely embodies extremism in French politics.
But I just want to drill down on those points, because if we look at according to some of the polls, the vote share of Marine Le Pen and Zemmour, they are making up about a quarter of the French population. So why do some French people have these concerns? Do you think that it's grounded in any reality? I think, for the last 10, 20 years, there's been talk about lack of assimilation amongst people that are descended from North Africa. There's been talks about religion and kind of almost clash of Islam with the French identity of laïcité, secularism. I mean, are these concerns valid at all, or do you think they're just being exploited for political gain?
Well, it certainly suits the far right in France to frame France as a country at war. And the far right are setting the agenda in France. They relish this kind of discourse, and they have successfully placed this kind of rhetoric at the centre of a national debate. Note how Éric Zemmour is a journalist. He knows exactly how to stir up a public debate. Marine Le Pen is also a great communicator.
Do you think there are any challenges when it comes to integration?
Well, there are certainly huge tensions in France, but the facts point to them being caused mainly by economic factors and not cultural ones. For example, rioting is pretty much institutionalized on a Saturday in France with groups like the Yellow Vests out with the anarchists and other groups and creating as much damage as possible. So the violence we've seen in recent years has been enormous, and it has created a huge amount of chaos by well-organized groups. And it has to be said that the Yellow Vests are primarily a white, working class, anti-government group, and not one that is rooted in foreign countries.
So would you say there isn't any problem then when it comes to integration of people of North African heritage into perhaps more traditional conceptions of French identity? Do you not see there to be any challenges at all?
No, I think the challenge is to view people of a foreign background, or indeed French people of the first, second and third generation, or even fourth generation now, to consider them as French citizens, people who were born and raised in France. But the facts are that they are very much still discriminated against. And Éric Zemmour, for example, what is absolutely baffling about his candidacy, he's a proven racist. He's got 2 criminal convictions against his name for spreading racial and religious hatred and indeed a collective guilt against minorities. He will be up in court in January again for saying that all children of immigrant backgrounds are, immigrants, child immigrants, are all rapists, murderers, and they all need to be sent back, for example.
So
he's also...
Then do you think, I mean, because if you're saying that, you know, there's problems of discrimination and that may exacerbate the challenges and tensions, some people have also said that potentially the French idea of secularism is a rigid one, that, for example, in the UK, we've chosen a much more relaxed approach in the sense of multiculturalism. That's had criticisms as well, but there is a sense that people can be British but also not have to sacrifice their own culture and background, whereas for France, with the banning of the niqab and also religious symbols, there is a quite strict and rigid sense of what it means to be a universalist or a secularist. Do you agree that that may have exacerbated tensions?
I mean, there is no doubt that secularism in France plays a huge important part in national life. But a myth about French secularism is that it's anti-religion, when in fact it actually isn't. It actually means that religion should be kept out of public affairs, out of political life. But liberal concepts such as secularism or indeed integration are in fact being weaponized by the political class in France, mainly against ethnic and religious minority groups. For example, secularism is by definition, you know, it should protect the expression of all religious belief, and yet it's being manipulated to keep Muslims in check.
But do you think that all of the challenges in France around integration, immigration and French identity are solely based off of discrimination from the kind of French state and French institutions against minorities? Do you see there to be at all a resistance to free speech and secularism and many of those kind of French concepts of égalité and fraternité and liberté? Or do you think it's only on the part of the French state and French institutions?
Well, listen, France is a country of dissent, and radical opponents of the government are just as likely to come from white working class as they come from people who can trace their origins back to immigrants to France. But France doesn't even have statistics based on race or religion or indeed ethnicity. So it's a very disingenuous to claim that there's a massive problem, that there's an enemy within posed by Islam and indeed Arabs or black people, when it's not based on tangible reality.
So what would you like to see change? I presume obviously you don't want Zemmour or Le Pen to succeed in their presidential ambitions, but what could France do in order to alleviate this sense of fragmentation that it seems that so many in France feel about the current status quo?
Well, I think France's problem is that it projects far-right extremists as mainstream candidates that should be taken seriously. Éric Zemmour, for example, he pushes a very sinister theory, which is the Great Replacement theory, which is essentially based on a white supremacist agenda, which maintains that inferior races from abroad breed far more than indigenous ones, and therefore they are on the path of replacing white indigenous people. And this is exactly the kind of theories about subhumans that the fascists of the 1930s adhered to before the Holocaust. Now, in recent years, we've seen white supremacists, theorists, like the New Zealand mosque attacker, if you remember from a few years ago, who were also supporters of the Great Replacement theory. So I think France needs to clean up its public space so as to label proven racist and anti-Semites like Éric Zemmour. Let's not forget that beyond his hatred of Islam, he made some very anti-Semitic comments claiming that France did not collaborate with Nazi Germany during the Holocaust. Now, this is not only a blatant historical lie, but an anti-Semitic one.
Well,
and public figures like that should be held to account.
Well, absolutely. And on GB News, we absolutely agree with holding public figures to account. Well, we hope to bring you more of this subject as the election campaign develops. But thank you so much for joining me, Nabila Ramdani, French-Algerian journalist. Coming up, we speak to Wokingham MP John Redwood about what the shock by-election result in North Shropshire means for the future of Conservatism. Don't go away.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else, I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Welcome back. We're asking, has science replaced morality? Or at least are claims to be acting based on science being used to cloak or avoid responsibility for political or moral goals? This question has become much more prominent in the public conversation since the government introduced first the restrictions in early 2020 to manage the spread of COVID-19. However, the question of whether scientific authority has replaced moral authority long predates 2020. The closing down of schools, the shutting down of the hospitality industry, to mandating that people stay at home. All of these policies have been justified on the basis of following the science. But can science really tell us how to live? Well, joining us now to discuss this is Professor Frank Furedi, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent. Frank, thank you for joining me. The first question I think that would be important to lay out for viewers is, in your understanding, what is the difference between science and scientism?
Well, science is something that is a legitimate way of using rationality and reasoning to solve the problems of society. And science has been a very important instrument in allowing humanity to transcend many of the challenges it faced. It has given us a lot of positive instruments to solve our problems. But science is very different than scientism, which basically uses the reputation of science, its formidable reputation, to deal with what are in fact human, social, and cultural problems. And therefore, scientism represents the attempt to use or claim to be able to use science to answer the questions that historically morality and moral issues used to provide for us. So it purports to tell us about the meaning of life. It attempts to kind of dictate to us as to how we should live our lives, how we should behave. And I think scientism is a kind of politicized ideological attempt to use the authority of science to somehow provide some moral resources for society or for government and officials to work by.
Frank, how do you see that in relation to something like managing the pandemic? Because presumably when it comes to something like the spread of COVID and when we didn't know in the very beginning, the only people that we can really look to are scientists. And yes, politicians are having to make political decisions about what industry they prioritise and so on. But in that instance, would that be regarded as scientism or a legitimate use of science in terms of how the pandemic has been managed and handled?
Well, I mean, science has been very important in dealing with the pandemic. I think the most important contribution that science made was in inventing all these new sort of vaccinations. I mean, that was a really positive contribution that was made by science. But when you have a government telling us, exhorting us to follow the science, and where science is seen almost as this independent, transcendental force that we just need to follow, what it basically does is it displaces the necessity for you and I and for everybody else to make judgment calls. And judgment calls are usually based upon moral norms, upon basically evaluating what is right and wrong for me, for my community, and for my family. And the attempt to suppress that and to limit that by the exhortation, follow the science, or science says, is a problem, because what it does is it gives science this quasi-religious character. Whenever I hear people use the expression, the science, it sounds a bit like, sort of they're saying the Bible. And when they say follow the science, it kind of reminds me of the exhortation to do God's will. And I think that we've now had a long time where scientism has been used in this way. It's used very much in the same way in global warming, because it's one thing to say that through science we learn about climate change. It's another thing to say that science tells us not to eat meat. Science tells us not to get into our cars. Science tells us not to travel. In other words, science is used to kind of control and influence the way we lead our lives. And those things are really ultimately moral, individual questions where, in a sense, where science has got no legitimate role to play.
And what it has come to develop into has been this technocracy, a kind of rule by experts. And what I've seen, it almost seems to be a delegitimization of common sense. And as you rightfully mentioned, allowing citizens to be able to make moral judgments for themselves. I mean, what effect do you think this has, Professor Furedi, on democracy and the public debate?
Well, I think its most important impact is that it diminishes the role that we attach to the citizen. My own work, my own research, which I've carried out on parenting, I was very shocked to discover that there's been this new sort of industry of parenting experts. And what parenting experts do is basically suggest that there is such a thing called parenting skill. And by emphasizing child rearing as this scientific accomplishment, what they've done is they've reduced the role of mothers and fathers and their responsibility for bringing up children to a secondary one. And I think what they've done to parents is also what they're doing to citizens, where they basically tell us that you and I are far too stupid to understand the really complex issues of our time, that everything in the world, all the problems that we're confronted with, is very difficult to understand by amateurs like us. And therefore, we basically need this very small group of highly intelligent individuals to essentially displace the role of the public and give us political and spiritual and moral guidance about how we face the future. And I think that kind of ambition on the part of expertise is one of the most corrosive developments in our public life, not just in Britain, but throughout the whole of the Western world.
And Frank, very quickly, how do you think we've got to this point? Because, I mean, presumably you would think that politicians and leaders would want to make a name for themselves as being able to, you know, put their arguments forward and in a clear manner and be able to convince the public and have that kind of authority. Or why would they want to avoid responsibility or hide behind experts? I mean, how do you think that we've got to this point where that is now seen as the default rather than actually making your case and winning it out in an open public sphere?
I think one of the tragedies of British politics is that political leadership has been displaced by the ideal of political management. So many of our leaders who are politicians basically operate like administrators or as managers rather than as political leaders. And I don't know if you noticed, but we now have a tendency to outsource decision-making all the time. So very often what politicians do, they say, well, this is a very complicated problem. We'll have some kind of, we'll set up an investigation, or we'll have a public inquiry. And if you look at the number of public inquiries that have been put in place in the last 10 years, they've kind of proliferated. There's far more of them than any other time in British history. So they're outsourcing decision-making all the time. And at this point in time, the experts become very, very convenient. So when you see Prime Minister Johnson sort of being flanked by two scientists, I mean, that is really, that captures this outsourcing of authority, because basically these two guys are there to kind of take responsibility away from him and his political government.
Yeah, and very quickly, frankly, we don't have much time. I mean, how do we go beyond this? How do we, in your view, I mean, it's a very big question, but how do we revive democracy and real political authority and moral authority and leadership?
I think we need to reconstitute the idea of a citizen being a moral political being that is capable of making judgments. I think we have to popularize the idea that you and I are able to make judgments about the key issues facing our lives. And that's not something we're prepared to leave to anybody else. I think that's the bottom line. And if you can do that, I think British politics will change for the better.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this evening, Professor Frank Furedi, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent. Thank you. Well, this week, also, the Conservatives lost one of their safest seats, with the Lib Dems taking a shock victory in North Shropshire by-election. Helen Morgan won by almost 6,000 votes to take the seat the Tories have held for almost 200 years. The by-election was sparked by the resignation of Owen Paterson over breaching lobbying rules. He had a 2019 majority of almost 23,000. The result applies more pressure now on Boris Johnson, with the Lib Dems describing this as a watershed moment in British politics. But what does this mean for the future of Conservatism and the Conservative Party? Well, joining me to discuss this is Conservative MP for Wokingham, Sir John Redwood. Thank you, Mr. Redwood, for joining me. If you look at 2019, firstly, there was a strong small c Conservative orientation to the Conservative victory: sovereignty, levelling up, border control, lower taxes. Is the by-election result almost a rebuke of Boris Johnson's failure to realise the aspirations of many of those voters in 2019, in your view?
Yeah, I think it was a shot across the bows. It was a clear warning, and the leading opposition party's vote fell quite a bit. The Conservative vote fell massively. Lots of people stayed at home. And I think lots of good Conservative voters from 2019 in that constituency said, come on, government, we want you to raise your game. We want you to do better. We want you to deliver the things you promised. I think they want a clear Brexit with the wins from Brexit, because we still haven't had many of those. Government's been very shy. I think they want the lower taxes, not the higher taxes that Mr. Sunak wishes to impose from April onwards. I think he should cancel the national insurance increase immediately. And of course, they were worried by all the noises off about senior civil servants and others apparently not obeying the rules that they were so keen to apply to the rest of us during the course of the pandemic. So it was a perfect storm. And I'm urging the Prime Minister to listen and to understand that they wanted a Conservative government with a small c as well as a big C, and they expect him to lead a recovery. They want optimism about the economy. They want lower taxes to fuel it. They want proper discipline in the public services.
I mean, do you think that our Prime Minister understands that? Do you think that he really understands what happened in 2019 and why people lent their vote to the Conservative Party? Do you really think that our Prime Minister understands that at a fundamental level?
Well, I hope so, and I and others have been trying to explain this in different formats and different ways, directly and indirectly through the media. And I think it's very difficult to interpret that by-election in any other way, and all the other things that we see in the national opinion polls. And yes, on a good day, I think the Prime Minister does fully understand. I think the Prime Minister has been hedged in by scientific advisors, by the Health Department, by the Treasury, who seem to be exceptionally negative when they ought to be positive and buying into the idea of a lower tax-led revival. And he's, in some senses, the chairman of the government, and he has to balance the forces. And I would urge him to be more independent of the health and scientific advisors, and certainly much more independent of the Treasury. So I think the Treasury is just getting it completely wrong, along with the Bank of England. And they are not allowing the economy to recover properly from the pandemic measures.
And what do you think Boris Johnson, stands for? I mean, many people have different ideas about who he is. When you speak to people on the left, they think he's this strong right government, this strong right prime minister. But he won London twice. He's very much seen as a liberal. I mean, what does Boris Johnson stand for? Who's his tribe? What brand of conservatism do you think he is?
Well, he's very pragmatic, and I think he changes his emphasis and mind, and there's a lot to be said for some flexibility. But I think he is finding it much more difficult running something the size of the United Kingdom government rather than running the mayoralty, where with a couple of strong lieutenants he had considerable grip. I think he's finding the government machine extremely big, and I think the pandemic has distorted everything, because it's very opposite of what Boris really wants to do and what he believes in. Because Boris does want to do the sort of things I'm saying. I think he wants to encourage, make sure that the economy goes well. I think he does really want to lower taxes. But the pandemic came along, and the whole government machine has been such a wet blanket.
I mean, you mentioned the pandemic, and I think many people are very sympathetic to that argument and have provided Boris Johnson with a lot of goodwill. But I mean, you look at the green agenda and a lot of the ways in which Boris Johnson has put that at the forefront of his agenda. So it's not a case of which he can only follow the pandemic management. He has been looking into implementing and advocating other things, but it doesn't seem to be the very things that people initially put him in power to do.
Well, I think the green agenda is something that needs very careful handling. So I think all Conservatives believe in conserving the natural environment, and we want clean air, we want clean water, but we also need plenty of affordable energy. And I think there is a big issue there. I'm urging the government to become less dependent on imports, whereas the officials, the experts, seem to want to make us ever more dependent on imports from the continent, which is an energy short part of the world, which is all too beholden to Mr. Putin. And I think you've got to take decarbonisation at the right pace, because it's not a good position to end up where you're, for example, at the moment, having to burn a lot of coal in power stations to keep the lights on, which is the opposite of what you want to do, because you've gone too fast on going over to wind farms. And when the wind doesn't blow, and there's not very much wind today, for example, you end up burning a lot of coal, which you don't really want to do. So I think they do need to look at more domestic energy and a better spread of energy. And I keep saying to them, answer my question. How do you generate the power when there's no wind and there's not much sun?
I mean, is Boris Johnson the right man to take these things forward? Is he really the right person to do that? Because I think, you know, some people have said that this isn't just about the parties and some of the sleaze, but actually people are losing confidence in the Prime Minister himself to be able to be the person to deliver many of those promises of 2019. Do you have confidence that Boris Johnson can deliver on those promises?
Well, I'm supporting him and urging him to do the right things, both for the country and therefore for himself. Why do I take that view? Well, because he decisively won the Conservative leadership, and I supported him then, and I would vote the same way again today if I had that particular choice. And he did then pursue Brexit in the way that he needed to do. Still quite a bit to sort out, though, on Brexit. And then, of course, he led the party to a very important election win with a big majority, and I think he added a lot to that election victory. So I think it'd be quite wrong to say today, you've had your chance, we want somebody else. I think he needs support, but also guidance and encouragement in order to make sure that those great achievements are now reflected in something really great for the nation. And, you know, I like the Boris Johnson who's all in favour of boosterism, who wants to encourage, raise confidence, get the animal spirits going. We want to allow people to go on their personal journeys. Surely we want more people to run their own companies, set up their own businesses, work for themselves, get promoted in their company, get better training, add to the wealth and the income of the nation and to themselves. And that should be the message. And I'm trying to get the Prime Minister to say more of that.
Well, in an interview with Sam Coates from Sky immediately, not soon after the result, Boris Johnson, he did say that the country's priorities are sorting out COVID and making sure the NHS is protected. I mean, do you really see that as the top priorities for the country right now? Or do you think there are other things that are the top priorities, such as levelling up, such as making sure that we don't massively expand the state? Do you see COVID and the NHS as the top priorities? Or in your view...
Hey, you've got to do both, haven't you? And indeed, if you don't do both, they could both fail, because we obviously need to put more cash, more people, more resource into the health service, which the government is seeking to do. But in order for that to be affordable, you need to grow the economy more quickly. I mean, it will cripple everything. If you take too much tax off people, you'll then not be able to afford the national health service you want. So I think you've got to grow the wealth and income at the same time. And I think at the moment, the Treasury has been getting it wrong. As is the Bank of England now. They both did a great job to offset the worst of the pandemic lockdowns in 2020, and I was all in favour of what they were doing then. They're now slowing everything down, tightening everything, threatening people, or actually putting in tax rises, national insurance, corporation tax, going up, IR35, very unhelpful to certain types of small business people. These are bad moves. They are doing damage, and far from getting the deficit down, they could actually put the deficit up, because if the economy doesn't grow, you end up borrowing more and you get less revenue. And they could certainly damage the longer term prospects for the health service, because the health service is clearly going to need a lot of extra resource going forward.
And then just finally, I mean, many of those voters that Boris Johnson acknowledged in 2019 lent their vote, the Red Wall voters that had traditionally voted for the Labour Party and switched to the Conservatives. Do you think that they should continue to be confident and should still rely on the Conservative Party to be able to deliver many of their aspirations?
Well, I want them to, but again, my message to the Prime Minister and to Michael Gove in particular, who's got the job of thinking this through a bit more, is that I think a lot of those voters want a bit of conservatism. They want to be able to set up their own business, or they want to pay less tax, or they want to have assistance in order to get better qualified and be promoted and earn more money, and then they want to keep more of their own money. These are great aspirations which help them and the nation. And I don't think levelling up is about building a new town hall and offering money for a tram in a city that hasn't done as well as some other cities. That isn't going to rescue a city. We've had years of trying that. By all means, make sure that there's decent transport. But the first thing you need to do is to work with the people. It's about these personal journeys. It's about encouraging and helping people to get on in the world, in every town and city in the country, and not just in London.
Well, thank you so much for discussing this with me, Sir John Redwood, MP for Wokingham. Well, that is all from us here on the discussion. I mean, hopefully it's been a fascinating show. We've talked about the future of conservatism, feminism and the gender debate, and the future of the French secularism and election. Well, thank you. That's all for me. Thank you for watching. Up next, it's Neil Oliver Live.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking rather cloudy for many, although there will be some clear spells around. Let's take a look at the details. Zooming into the southwest, and although it will be drier, there'll be plenty of cold around, although parts of Devon and Cornwall will see some clearer skies at times. Southeast England and East Anglia will also see rather cloudy skies, with the cloud lowering to give some mist and fog in places. Western Wales will have a largely clear but chilly evening, whereas further east it'll be cloudy, with cloud breaks limited. After a very grey day today, the Midlands and Eastern England will continue cloudy and murky this evening. There will also be some mist and fog in places, perhaps becoming locally dense at times. Moving towards northern England, and we should see plenty of clear skies this evening, especially across Cumbria and Northumberland. This will lead to a chilly evening with perhaps some isolated fog patches forming. The coastal areas and the central belt of Scotland may see some cloud linger this evening, but elsewhere across Scotland will be dry and clear, leading to a cold start to the night.